Can you hear me now? I love those thumbs up. Welcome, everyone. My name is Robin Anderson. I'm with Emerging Ag and a passionate farmer from Canada, where we have taken an interest in our soils for the past almost 40 years, working on innovations like conservation tillage that have made a huge difference in our ability to protect the soil organic matter and in our soils, in our fields. And in this capacity, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with some of the leaders around getting soils on the agenda. Here at the climate negotiations, we have a set of actors who will be speaking to you today, but we also have a number of sessions that have been happening all over COP, because over the past few years, there's been a concerted effort to really get the climate change negotiations focused on including soil carbon sequestration, the health of our soils, the biodiversity of our soils, the organic content of our soils into the agenda here at COP. The only way that we will be able to allow agriculture to deliver its part of a net zero commitment is by appreciating the content of our soils. So today we're going to have an expert panel, and I'm really excited to have all of them with us. We're going to be starting with Sig here. Sig is one of the leading soil scientists, and we'll be doing 2 brief panels and then moving to some concluding remarks. But really, fundamentally, the purpose of this event is to think about not only the climate COP that we're in, but also the way in which this links to several COPs that have happened. You may have heard recently about the Biodiversity COP that's was taking place in Colombia. And shortly, some of us will be going on to Riyadh and Saudi Arabia to talk about the CCD, to talk about drought and desertification and land degradation. So we want to talk here about the positive benefits of soils and how we address climate change by tackling the quality of those soils, protecting the ones that are in good stead, reclaiming and diversifying and making healthy the soils that are struggling, which is about 1/3 of our soils around the world. And that's going to take every single one of us. We are going to need a multi-stakeholder partnership right across farmers, the scientists, the NGOs that we'll have here today, like World Wildlife Federation, the farmers like Keith Curry who are working in the field, and of course the private sector, the UN, and the member states who have the ability to take their soils seriously, create a landscapes approach to managing them and to making sure that soil carbon sequestration is recognized here at the UN as a method to calculate carbon. So with that, I really want to hand over to the amazing Sig Snap. Sig, can you tell us a little bit about the soils, the state of our soils today, and how they intersect with our planet?
Thank you. If I can have the clicker. Great. So my name is Sig. I'm at CIMMYT. You may have heard of us, the Center for Maize and Wheat, and we do a lot on conservation agriculture, so glad to hear what you've been doing on your farm. I think the farmers I've met here have just been extraordinary. I always learn together, which is really, really special. So thanks for this opportunity to talk a bit about the intersectionality, because indeed soils are needed to help address the challenges, how we're getting outside the planetary boundaries, around biogeochemical nutrient cycling, around climate change, obviously. So now is the time to be talking about these really challenging, as we know, I think all of us, unfortunately, have experienced floods and fires like we've never seen before. And the other crisis, as has been mentioned, is under our feet. It happens in a much slower time step, and so it tends to be overlooked because we're stepping on it, right? So the slow push of resource degradation, and myself, even as a soil scientist, I resisted this for years. I thought, really, if it's as bad as some people said 30 years ago when I first came to Africa, we'd have no soil left today. So it isn't maybe 100 tons of soils per acre, because also some of that soil, unfortunately, washes down to other people. So we have to remember it's complex. And soils vary if you're a farmer, you know from here to there, soils vary and you have to know how to manage that. So there's degradation, but some of our work has shown there's aggradation. Some farmers are managing, despite everything, to increase their soil carbon in novel ways, and we have to acknowledge that. So I'm going to talk just briefly about building healthy soils, diversifying plants, and promoting agency amongst people. Again, it is plants that produce the carbon that then feeds the microbes in the soil. So plants are essential for healthy soils. And then again, they only grow if there's healthy soil. So they go back and forth. And these are all influenced by the agency of people. So we are really promoting a summit with our partners, public, private, and civil society. For example, this work in India has really recently been taken over partly by the Indian government, partly by private sector, and even some civil society actors in the farmer organizations. And that we're trying to see where nitrogen is needed and where it's really water limitations. We can't just be promoting fertilizer without realizing that there may be other factors. And so you need these intensive landscape level interactions with what is growing where, what is the yield, and who is making that decision about that. We're also finding new things. For example, weed diversity. Did you know weed diversity can be a major driver of soil organic matter? So when herbicides are coming in Africa, which is great for reducing drudgery, for particularly women are often champions of herbicides, but there are toxicity issues, and there could be soil organic matter. You know, as you know, in conservation agriculture, then if you judiciously kill weeds at the right time, but we have to have those roots, right? So if we did scorched earth, which some people have been promoting, you wouldn't necessarily get soil carbon. So we have to be, it's complicated. And compost and manure, not surprisingly, really important organic sources. Sometimes it's been said there's not enough in Africa. Well, maybe, but we're starting to see some of that change, and we need to promote that as well as fertilizers, because they're we need to geo-target. And so then private industry may invest. Part of soil health is where it's not a case of these are bad farmers not using the right nutrients. It is a case of where should the investments be. So soils is a lot about information and in getting that to the farmers, getting it to private sector. But also new types of crops, because crops ultimately protect and improve soils. We've often think of trees, but recently it's come up more and more that certain grasses and sorghum and maize, as ultimately, giant grasses that produce food, are really important for carbon sequestration. But in the past, this was like what a research station might look like. Does that look like what a farmer's? No. So maybe what's produced here may not be actually relevant to all the farmers. To make sure we have a greener revolution, we must reach those last mile farmers, many of whom are actually looking for soil improving crops. And it's not just legumes. Sorghums can improve soils, but we need to be selecting for that. So sometimes agricultural research stations are important, but not enough. We need to be working on with farmers. So these are the types of infrastructure that we're moving more towards, deep data sets over time and space to understand soils, plants, and people, which I'm very excited about at CIMMYT. And again, crop diversity matters. You don't get, from conservation agriculture, you don't get soil carbon sequestration unless you have diversity. So you get more when there's more diversity. And also you have to take into account the nitrogen level. If you're using basically simplified, if you're using a lot of nitrogen, then the diversity isn't as important. But the world is running out of fossil fuel derived fertilizer, nitrogen, right? So we need to be relying more on diversity for soil health and for nitrogen cycling. So just to wrap up, building soil health does take database. So we just need to, because if we try and do it everywhere, it may not be a profitable investment for farmers or for other investors. Long-term experiments, These are slow processes, complicated processes, folks. So therefore, we need these big data sets over time and space. As scientists, we should be providing this and not doing little tiny experiments, but really working with farmers to design things that make sense to them. And finally, in the end, it is the stakeholders that will make this all work. So we need to engage them beginning, middle, and end. Thank you so much. Looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you all so very much. SIG is just such a wonderful font of information and understanding the texture, literally the texture of soils and all the ways in which you have to address them using a variety of techniques. And I think that sets us up very well to bring up our next panel. And I'm going to appreciate the CG and the FAO for hosting us in this beautiful pavilion. And that's been arranged courtesy of CIMMYT, whom SIG represents, and also C4 ICRAF. So please come up. Lee Winoweki. Lee is the leader of the Coalition of Action for Soil Health and a leading soil scientist with one of the most comprehensive soil databases that really exists anywhere in the world. I've had the chance to tour her lab in Nairobi. It's extraordinary. The work they've done on creating dry method solutions for testing is just beyond imagination, and she's a tremendous energetic leader for all of us. And Damien Fleming, World Wildlife Federation, has been ahead of the curve on discussing the importance of soils. We have International Year of Rangelands coming up, so we'll be talking about the importance of some of those big grasses in a different way, and you've been a leader in this space. Thank you so much, Damien, for joining us. So I think the first part of the panel is to talk about how do we get people motivated about this thing that we step on that we might have been not paying enough attention to. Lee, you always talk about soils as a unifier. Why do we all need to care?
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you to everyone for coming here. And I think this demonstrates just the fact that we have such a broad audience here, that the momentum around soil health is really growing. Soil is critical for food and nutrition security. It's critical for ecosystem restoration. It's also critical for climate action, climate change mitigation and adaptation. Within the Coalition of Action for Soil Health, we do say soil is a unifier. It's a way that we've seen stakeholders coming together, and this includes stakeholders that are often, maybe not always at the same table. And it's really important that if we want to have real action on the ground, everyone needs to be at the table. Farmers, industry, research, development organizations, really everyone. And we've seen this growing momentum since the UN Food Systems Summit. And you can see, go check the schedule, how many events at this COP are on soil. This is really important. We know that soil is the third largest carbon sink, and we can have climate action if we really start investing in soil through agricultural practices that are nature-based solutions. So I'm really pleased to continue this momentum and make sure we have real action. One outcome of this COP is the NDCs. Countries are updating their NDCs right now. Less than 30 NDCs currently include soil health. This is a mark. Let's make sure we're talking to our government representatives. If you are from government or work with government, let's make sure that the next version of the NDCs mentions how they're going to improve soil health, and increase the carbon sequestration in the soil.
Fantastic call to action, Lee. Sig, you framed this up for all of us about the complexity and the diversity of soil and the invaluable role it plays. Can you tell us a little bit about the specific projects that you're working on and how you're working with others?
Thank you so much. So, in fact, I think what it is about partnerships, and so it's really, and scaling. Realizing soil health at scale is, many farmers manage it, and we don't always celebrate it properly, but what we need to do now is realize it. So our projects are a lot about what type of extension works where, what type of pluralistic extension. For example, we're working with Viamo, who people from flip phones can call in and leave their opinions and ask for advice on regular Airtel type mobile devices. And so that's in Zambia and Malawi. And so people are now starting to be able to access, there's something like 5,000 farmers for every extension agent. So we have to figure out how to reach more farmers that way. Other ones, it's a people and digital approach. Champions to make sure that farmers who don't have access, that's often women, to mobile phones get information too and learn how to access in some of these modern ways where dry soils, you can actually measure from your phone how your soil is performing. But we need to make sure it's inclusive, that everyone is that. So we have different experiments on how to be inclusive, how to make sure youth is interested in soil health, and then also elderly, like making sure who are often the farmers, are all at the table. So those are some of our projects we're really excited about.
You're doing so much exciting work. Let's talk to Damien a little bit. WWF has done some great work on forests and NDCs. We're interested from a soil perspective, also about how carbon sequestration can replicate some of the attention that forests has had. And the good work on soils actually links directly to the same process. Those trees are sequestering carbon in the soils. So please tell us a little bit about how we can take your forest and NDC learnings into the examples that Lee was talking about, getting soil engaged in NDCs.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me here. Just a question before I begin. How many people have read Susan Simard's book, The Mother Tree? Only a few of you. Well, I would really recommend reading it. I think that really, she's an incredible writer, and she really, I think, brings out the symbiotic relationship between trees and soils and other trees through mycorrhizal networks under the ground and how they exchange nutrients and water and sugars. It's a really incredible, and I say that because I'm a forest expert. I'm feeling very humbled by these soil scientists here, but I want to talk a little bit about the role of forests and also the real need for more integration across different disciplines, which I think is still very much lacking at the moment. So in terms of restoration, we really followed the 6 principles of forest landscape restoration. The first, well, one of the important ones of those is about maintaining and enhancing ecosystem health. And I say this is important because restoration isn't just about planting new trees, about restoring soils, it's about maintaining the biodiversity that we already have. And unfortunately, the situation is not great. Last year, we lost 6.4 million hectares of forests. And the food system is actually the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. So we desperately need to tackle that if we are going to meet all of our climate, nature, and social development goals. One of the other principles of forest landscape restoration is to restore multiple functions for multiple benefits. So we're not just talking about ecological restoration here, we're also talking about socio-economic functions. This is also very, very important. And perhaps the most fundamental principle of forest landscape restoration is working under a landscape approach with integrated mosaic landscapes. Really, really critical. So I've been asked to bring a couple of examples, what we're doing in the forest space, hopefully relevant to you, bringing some of this to life. So one of those is in the Colombian Amazon, in Caquetá. I'm lucky enough to have been there in the south in my WWF career. And this is an area that's been hugely impacted by conflicts. So, until fairly recently, communities' only real choice to have a livelihood was to grow illicit crops. And through our forest landscape restoration initiative, we've really been able to turn that round. You talked about the agency of people, and this is really crucial here. One of the other principles of forest landscape restoration is participatory governance. And so we work very, very closely there with farmer groups, not just to restore forests, but actually in order to have them work towards cocoa production and also sustainable livestock systems, beef and dairy, and alongside traditional crops as well. The impacts there have been really incredible. We've seen social restoration in terms of reintegrating families that have been separated through conflict. We've seen economic restoration in terms of export agreements with European companies really paying at a living wage. And of course, we've seen climate and nature restoration through the working with the national parks that we have there. Second example is our forest landscape restoration initiative in Africa. I think you gave some of the situation that we face in Africa at the moment. It's pretty stark. 90% of people in Africa rely on fuel wood and charcoal for energy use, principally cooking. 65% of land in Africa is degraded. And a key point here again is forest landscape restoration isn't just about planting trees, it's about restoring the whole ecological landscape. We work on governance and policy, we work on finance, and we work on markets, including agroforestry. We also work on obviously scaling on the ground. Again, very, very ambitious program, but some really incredible results. We have 2 million hectares of forests already under restoration. NDCs you mentioned, we have 40 million hectares under commitments in government's NDCs. This is really crucial because this is really what drives ambition. And we've also been able to work through our stakeholder forums. We have multi-stakeholder forums in all 9 countries. And we've been able to develop sustainable businesses, women, youth, IP and LC-led, over 80 sustainable businesses. So really exciting results there. Finally, you asked me about NDCs. I think I had 7 minutes. I hope I'm running to time. So this is really, really crucial. I mean, NDCs, as you said, governments are now in the process of submitting theirs ahead of beginning of next year. Some have already submitted theirs. Brazil submitted theirs with some fairly strong targets around forests. But there's a huge amount of work still to be done on NDCs. We also have conducted a study looking at the amount of forest targets, emissions targets with NDCs. It's really inadequate. Less than a half of NDCs. I mean, soils are badly represented. You would think forests are better represented. They absolutely aren't. Less than 50% of NDCs currently have forest targets within them. So there's a huge amount of work still to be done on that. And a big part of WWF's work is also working not just on the ground, but also working to ensure that forests and food are much better integrated within NDCs going forward.
Fantastic, Damien. I think I have heard the governor from Para speak with passion, who will be hosting us next year in COP, about the importance of our understanding of forests and preserving forest space to also include having livings for the people that live there. And he was absolutely unequivocal that we have to find a way to make those things work together. I'm going to just forewarn the panel that I'm going to go a little bit rogue while we have the team up here, and say that I'm going to come to the audience for questions in just a moment. But a question back to you, Damien. You said, oh, well, soils are actually ahead of forests. I think those of us working on soils feel like forests are a bit ahead. How have you been able to get the political agenda, the public agenda around tree planting, around forests, into the spaces in a way that I think we're still struggling to get people focused on soils? What can you teach us?
Yeah, well, I don't think I said soils are ahead of forests. If I did, I didn't mean that. I think I think soils absolutely need to be much higher up the agenda. I mean, we feel still that forests, aren't high enough on the agenda, but it's been a much longer, I think, work from WWF to really work on the role of forests particularly on climate. I think the science is now well understood that forests represent, up to 30% of the mitigation potential in terms of closing the emissions gap. And I think, I think what's also been very helpful has been a lot of the conversations I've had here, but obviously over the last maybe 10 years or so around nature-based solutions. So I think forests are not only important and recognized for the role they play in mitigation, but also, a well-maintained forest is very important in terms of climate adaptation. But also, I mean, NBS is all about addressing societal challenges. And so I think a really key thing is that people element, right? Demonstrating how this isn't only good for climate and good for nature, it's really, really good for people. And I think that's where restoration, I think, has a really exciting role to play, because, we want to develop a restoration-based economy where we are creating livelihoods, where we are creating local economies in restoration, and it's not just about trees, it's about agroforestry systems and how trees and agriculture can work together.
That's amazing. Any indications for a question on this panel? I'll come back to you in a moment. Lee, how do you take up this clarion call that we've got to find a way to bridge landscapes? We've mentioned landscapes approaches a couple of times now. I don't think we've really stopped to define what that is. Can you talk a little bit about how you see it as a whole picture?
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for the deep insights on how we can be as popular as the forests are. One of the things when we talk about landscape, and one of the things I'd like to bring in is this real need for better understanding the soil ecosystem across landscapes. And Sig touched on it in her presentation that now we have new tools, innovation, new sampling techniques to really be able to understand how soil varies from farm to farm across landscapes. Because let me give you an example. I'm at C4eCraft based in Nairobi, and we have a really amazing project where we're working and sampling soil from the top of the Taita Taveta Hills across the agricultural fields down the mountain. Just sampling the rangelands and just sampling the forest wouldn't be enough, because actually these hills are water towers. They're also carbon towers. And the rangelands below deeply depend on that water coming from that forested ecosystem. So when we think about landscapes, it's all the different ecosystems that are really interconnected and dependent on each other. And of course, the pastoralists, the agriculturalists, and the foresters, and those who depend on the forest, really all are connected through the soil. And one of the things we're doing at C4eCraft is filling these knowledge gaps. So we're doing a lot of soil sampling using a robust methodology to sample the soil, and soil spectroscopy to analyze the soil. And we actually have accurate maps. So we can now say how much carbon is stored in these different ecosystems, because I think rangelands in particular have been underappreciated in just how much carbon they can store deep in the soil. And so by you generating this evidence, it's really important that we leverage it now, so we can go to and support the countries and say, we can map your soil carbon so that you can track changes over time for your NDCs, for the ecosystem restoration goals, for your biodiversity and BSAPs. So I think there's a really exciting time now for generating this evidence across landscapes. And I'll hand it back to Robin.
Sorry, we're just getting some headphones for someone up here in the front row. So I think one of the things that you touched on is really how these rangelands and grasslands in between these spaces are important. And you mentioned this role of deep roots in terms of sequestering carbon, creating water resources as well. Do you want to further elaborate on that, Sig?
Absolutely. I started in roots, so we can't leave them. But I actually want to say that how we get them there, I think we have to get everyone at the table. Crop breeders need to give us crops that have deeper roots, maybe longer duration crops. We've always gone for short duration, high yielding, but high yielding for the planet, right? Deep ones. But also, I think I really disagree with the idea that farmers should be the ones that get us over the hump. That has to be feasible for them, and it's challenging the way the ecosystem and the environment, basically the economics have been set up for farming, as I do farm, or at least someone farms for me, so I really know how that is. So it does take conservation agriculture. I don't know how long it took for you, but it often does take 3 or 4 years before those roots improve that soil enough that you start sequestering carbon, sequestering water, as you said, improving the cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus. So how are we going to get farmers over that? Instead of just saying it works better, why don't these bad farmers take this up? How are we going to get people over that hump? I think that we really need to get roots back on the landscape, and regenerative agriculture, pastures, all these things. We have to look at the policies that incentivize it. And we also have to look at the knowledge that it often takes, extra knowledge. It's easier to apply fertilizers than to grow roots and figure out how we're going to then release enough nitrogen at the right time in the right place. And so a lot of it, I trust farmers. They do have the deep knowledge, but then how do we get them over that hump? And so that's where I think our subsidies should look at these days, instead of just focusing on the short term. Thanks.
You touched on the subsidies issue, which is a big part of this mix, and I think this question of crop rotation and having pull-through markets for products like hemp, like legumes, that are really driving some of that biodiversity in the cropping system, but also in the soil, makes a lot of sense. I also see a farmer in the group, A.G. Kawamura is here. He's an urban farmer, and I've heard some of the stories about work he has done to take areas in cities that are literally have been paved over, were urban spaces, military bases, etc., and being given the task to try and bring soils that we've actually killed through our urban living approaches back to life. And that's a really extraordinary story. So I think that all farmers are on that journey in all contexts and all spaces. So shout out to all of the farmers in the crowd on this. Do we have a question from the audience for this panel?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tembi. I'm from Fanapan. I think my question is in regards to the African Declaration on Soil Health that was done in Nairobi. Just want to find out, like, how can international organizations come together to support Africa to be able to deliver on some of the commitments that were taken in Nairobi?
Thank you so much for bringing that to the conversation. So for those of you who don't know, we just in Nairobi hosted the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit. And this is a follow-on from the 2006 Africa Fertilizer Summit. Do you notice some new words there? So we're really excited that soil health is on the agenda. Most countries in Africa have signed on to the declaration, the 4 pillars, one of which is around building soil information systems so that we can better manage, target soils. And of course, countries are developing national soil strategies. So it's a really exciting time, and I think we have to be at the table. Everyone, farmers organizations, farmers, international organizations, to really provide input and engage. Just last week in Zimbabwe, FARA was nominated as the Secretariat of the Soil Initiative for Africa. And I think be proactive. Let's start writing FARA, start writing African Union, because it is their African Union's mandate to implement the action plan. And I think we need to make sure everyone's at the table. So awesome.
Excellent. And maybe we should just explain that Zimbabwe is actually hosting the hub for the implementation on the fertilizer and soil health proposals. So it is going to be central to some of this conversation. Sig, you're also working in Africa in particular. How are you finding the outcomes of the discussion trickling down through your work, and how did they escalate into the outcomes of that summit?
As you said, it's really great to see the conversation moving on. When I came to Africa in 1993, I was shouted at for suggesting we could improve soil health. He said, well, in the tropics, these poor farmers, they can't possibly do it. And yet in Zimbabwe especially, I've seen for a long time that farmers are doing it. And so now we need to acknowledge that. And it is, I think, at the same time, how we get people over that hump I was talking about. I think we have to look at responsible sourcing. These new carbon markets make something work. They're only like 5% of all the carbon market work in the world is being tried out in Africa. So it's really time, and it's all forests, which is, of course we need forests. But we also need agricultural examples. So I think people in this room, Africa's going to make this work. And so if we can be there to support, if we can be providing documentation of what works where, is really exciting to me, because I do see it happening on the ground. But we still have that connection to build between the declarations and the proliferation of positive examples on the ground. Thank you.
Absolutely. One of the things that, when you were talking about our journey, that we found in addition to moving to a conservation tillage system is we were able to get more pulses into our mix, right? So it's also experimenting with how are you bringing that legume and that rotation into the system. Damien, as we think about the pressure that you were talking about, agriculture and forestry maybe being somewhat at odds, yet really quite cohesive, what are some of your best takeaways about how we work through soils, through farming, to reduce that pressure on our landscape in our forestry?
That's a great question, and I think the one message I would really like to leave with all of us, and it's a message to myself as well, is that we've learned about the interdependence of soil health, food systems, forests, grasslands. I mean, these things need to be talked about together, and they're totally independent. And I do see that at the moment we are still very much operating in silos. Even here slightly, how can we get more of the forest spotlight and limelight, and how do we get more forest carbon? I think we need to really be much more in the room together. And we're guilty even within WWF. I'm here on invitation of our food practice, and we don't talk anywhere near enough, right? So I think we need to really, not just on the ground in our landscapes and really look at this landscape approach that I mentioned, but also in our policy and advocacy. I mean, you mentioned subsidies, right? I think there needs to be a much more joined up conversation also on subsidy reform, not just, in terms of conservation, agriculture, tillage and seed varieties, but how more integrated systems, how we can repurpose subsidies to really looking at more the ecological landscape approach. So I really would, a call to action for all of us to really act together much more as one community and break down those silos.
Fantastic. I think we always feel like WWF has their act together in these spaces. So to realize that even you need to continue to talk more really spurs all of us onto understanding that. And I think it comes from the fact that we're all literally rooted in the same system, right? We talked about trees are sequestering carbon successfully in the soil through roots. And Sig talked about that. That's exactly what other plants are doing in the form of our crops. So really understanding that we're talking about that same ecosystem, that the success in forestry, the success in agriculture all comes back down to that soil, and the root systems that are living in them are absolutely key to our success on this. Panel, I'm going to give you a classic challenge, but we're being taped. We're out there in the Twitter sphere and the X sphere. The Instagram sphere, all the other social media spheres. Can you give us a quick, 1 minute takeaway about our soils?
Well, I think I said it at the beginning that soil health is literally the foundation of healthy ecosystems, and within that human-modified ecosystems. Our Living Planet report, which was launched last month, told us that we've lost wildlife populations at 73% decline in my lifetime, and also that many of our ecosystems are facing ecosystem collapse. The Amazon is facing tipping points. We're all part of the same system that I think you mentioned. So, again, my main message is we need to break down those silos. We need to work together more. We're all interdependent on each other. We're all dependent on those soil, the foundations of healthy ecosystems. And so we need to research together. We need to do our policy work together, and we need to work together on the ground.
Well, I can't say it better than that, other than to say that soils are a little different than some of the catastrophic things I see going on, in that soils are really good in some places and then really falling apart in others. And so it's super variable versus, I'm heartbroken by the massive biodiversity declines overall. And people then worry about biodiversity in soils. Actually, it's a fantastic proliferation right around, say, irrigation or liming, or where good farming has been done of biodiversity. So I think highlighting more, again, it comes back to not just soils and plants, but agency, people. Let's really empower those who are managing in difficult situations, super dry, no resources, and yet we've all seen that food forest, those amazing gardens that people have done in the middle of nowhere. And recently we've published maps showing that, in fact, the world's maps are wrong. They often estimate everywhere no soil, agricultural soil, is above 1.5% carbon in southern Africa. That is not true. Some farmers are at 3%. So we cannot gloss over the amazing role, the agency that people have, and we need to celebrate that more and actually empower people to protect the soils. Thank you.
So I would end with soil is life, and we all the planet critically depends on healthy soil. With healthy soil, we will achieve ecosystem restoration, climate change mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and of course, food and nutrition security. And through soil stewardship, through this agency, we can improve soil health.
Amazing. Please give a round of applause for this panel. Thank you. And I'm going to ask our next set of extraordinary leaders to come up. So Bruno Brazil is here from the government of Brazil. He works with the director, he's the director of sustainable production, irrigation from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Brazil. He's going to be our host next year, so we're very excited to have him here. And I think you are the perfect example of what Damien was talking about, where you've got agriculture, forestry, soils all intersecting, and I think we have a lot to learn and in the growth process that you're having about how to manage these processes. We have a very exciting woman here. Sheila Barefoot is in. She is with the Environmental Justice Program Management and Poetry for a Planet and Wisdom Keepers. She was doing a poem, I think, earlier today. We're going to get her technical expertise from UC Berkeley and her own background in plant genetics. So we appreciate you as a scientist as well as an incredible spokesperson on these issues. Thank you. And then Keith Curry, please, Keith. Keith, I've known Keith for many years. Keith is a fellow farmer from Canada. He is the head of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and a member of the board of the directors of World Farmers Organization. Andrea is here as well. We so appreciate the farmers major group that is here trying to get a lens on some of these issues. Thank you for the leadership you and WFO and all the farmers here show about focusing in on our soils. So Bruno, I'm going to kick off with you. You've heard a whole conversation that sets up the conversation that might be coming up in your own country and also in your role as a host here at COP. What are you thinking about how to get soils into this agenda?
Thanks, Robin. That's a great question. It's a pleasure to join this session, this debate about soil health. Thanks for the organizers for the invitation. You're all already invited to join us at COP30 in November next year in the city of Belém. We are thrilled and really anxious to get you all there. For Brazil, actually, when we discuss the climate agenda, we are always also discussing the biodiversity and the combat to the desertification agenda. Because for us, the core of our nature-based agenda and climate agenda is land use and how we manage well land and, of course, soil health. So Brazil has the largest rainforest in the world. We are also an agricultural powerhouse, and our energy matrix is quite renewable, so basically we have to deal how to produce more and more sustainable without threatening the forests and biodiversity. Just to give you an example, that's why Brazil has, since 2010, implemented a sectorial policy to increase the productivity in a sustainable way of agriculture and livestock production, while improving the management of soil and water, thereby reducing the pressure for opening of new areas. Just for the first decade, we managed to expand the adoption of sustainable practices such as no-tillage systems, integrated livestock crop forest systems, also recovery of degraded pastures, among others, in over 54 million hectares in Brazil. That led to a mitigation of over 190 million tons of CO2 equivalent. But we intend to do more for this next decade. We are targeting 1 gigaton of mitigation by 2030. And we have just launched our updated NDC, and I also invite you to read the document. It's very comprehensively by giving the details of our domestic policies designed to address those. And you are going to see all this debate around how to preserve forest and biodiversity while managing soil health and water for agricultural production.
A fantastically ambitious agenda from our hosts. And as ever, we're expecting you to protect all our forests and protect our soils and host us all. Sheila, you are an incredibly eloquent person. We've heard a number of great conversations about soils. I thought Lee said it beautifully. Soil is life. What gives you passion about soils?
So in order to get a taste of what gets me passionate about soils, you can just take a look at my earrings. Land back. I think that there are many strong ways to make arguments for Indigenous sovereignty, including the fact that we're human beings. But one of the very obvious connections between Indigenous sovereignty and climate change and health is soil. It is quite literally land. If we don't have jurisdiction over our own lands and waters, then we will not be able to implement Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science that the UN is quite popularly now saying. Everyone likes to say Indigenous knowledge this, Indigenous science that. Yes, that does not exist outside of Indigenous sovereignty. So sovereignty and control over our lands is one of the things that gets me excited about soil health. The other thing that gets me excited about soil health starts from when I was a baby. So I grew up in Tracy, California, which is a very agricultural part of the state. And up until I was 2, my family and I lived right across the road from an industrial tomato plant, like an industrial tomato field. And they would spray the crops with planes, pesticide planes. And whenever that happened, they would be like, quick, get the baby in the house. They're spraying the crops again, because they were spraying us with pesticides. So regenerative agriculture and going back to traditional methods of food production and keeping ourselves safe, healthy, fed, and nourishing our relationship with the land while we're nourishing our bodies is one of the things that gets me excited about soil.
Beautifully said. And I think, Keith, as we talk about farmers taking that land seriously, Indigenous people taking the land seriously, governments taking land seriously, how are you approaching this on your own farm and across the policy landscape in the World Farmers Organization about soils?
Well, I don't think we have a long enough panel to be able to fully address that, but certainly, I mean, I want to touch on something that Sig said right off the start when she talked about it all starts with what's under our feet. You know, this conference and the previous COP conferences before us have really focused on emissions, but the reality is everything starts under your feet first. You can't deal with emissions until you deal with the soil that will actually help you deal with the emissions that you want to control. So from that perspective, certainly farmers, one thing you have to understand is it's hard to farm green if you're farming in the red. We have to start with that first, and Sig touched on that a little bit. It is about the economics that's going to allow us to do what we need to do. Some of that is on farm incomes being better so that we can continue to evolve in our practices and our technologies that's available. Some of that is about the ability to have the right type of best management practices that I don't want to, Damien talked about subsidies. I don't want to use the term subsidies. I want to talk about investment. To attract the right investments into agriculture to help us, whether that's better connectivity to use better types of technologies on our farm, whether that's expanding the 4R program of the right source, right rate, right time and right place, which farmers really conceptually have been doing since the beginning of time. So we need to continue to make sure that we have that combination of everybody, because what I struggle with the most is the practical implementation of stuff on the ground. We have policymakers that don't understand what works on the ground. We have farmers that don't understand what goes into making policy. So how do we bring all the players to the table so that we make sure that what we're doing is right? And if it takes a little bit of extra time to get it right or get there, that's okay. Setting hard deadlines is always a failure or a recipe for disaster. So how do we get the players together and realize that one size does not fit all? I look at Canada being 7,000 kilometers wide with multiple various microclimates and soil types. Now when you expand that to the entire world, how do you make one thing fit across the planet? You can't. But conceptually, the practices can be interpreted and altered to fit the needs of the region that you're in. So that's where we need governments to understand that we need to work with the farmers, because the farming and forestry is where it's going to happen. That's where your biggest opportunity to mitigate and adapt. All things climate change happens. Unfortunately, not everybody on the outside of the farm gate understands that. So how do we have those conversations to make that happen?
Absolutely. And, you know, our Indigenous communities, our farmers are doing the work on the ground. Our foresters are doing the work on the ground. But we have this challenge that if we don't get soil carbon sequestration recognized in these carbon markets, agriculture, which can actually get to net zero, unlike many other sectors, can get there, but only if we are counting what we're actually putting into the ground. Do you think that there is a policy path to get more serious about this and making sure that soils really are part of the discussion about carbon markets?
I worry that we rely on policy paths too much. I think before we get to a specific policy path, we need the type of investment in the proper data, the right research out there before we worry about setting policy that may fail. On my farm, I haven't seen a plow in 20 years. Right, I've been no-tilling that long, and just the improvement you see over time in the soil structure, the ability to absorb drought conditions, the ability to absorb water when it's flooding, is incredible. The soil health, the biodiversity in species that may not normally be there is incredible. So we can have the right policy to help us. The problem is the people making the policy don't always understand what is the right policy to work, as I said earlier, on the ground. So I would be cautious about rushing to a policy decision unless it's a conceptual decision to get to the right place.
Excellent. Well, and I think that's one of the big challenges we have in, building out the carbon markets. We really do know that we're moving to recognizing soils, and we're talking about regenerative agriculture. We heard that term used. That actually is really founded on take the soils seriously first. He's mentioned policymakers who may not be familiar with agriculture. Thankfully, you are a policymaker who is familiar with agriculture. When you start thinking about soils, is it becoming, in addition to the programming that you were talking about, which is already impressive, how are you intersecting with your farmers so that they're thinking about their soils in a different way?
Thanks, Robin. Actually, I'm learning. I'm actually a researcher, and it's been 2 years now that I'm into policymaking, so I'm learning. For example, from the farmer's perspective, he's always working on soil health. Actually, soil is the basis of his activity. Then we bring biodiversity, climate change, GHG, and all of that. But that's the scientific point of view. I believe what Keith has mentioned here, it's a really pragmatic way. What we do in policymaking for agriculture in Brazil is put the farmer's perspective in the core of policy design. We must understand the farmers and ranchers' needs, how they develop their business in order to arrange the right incentives that can really deliver results in a sustainable way. What I'm telling is because we always look for sustainable technologies that are not only sustainable from the environmental point of view, but that they are profitable for the producers, increasing productivity, reducing costs. So you do not need to rely on subsidies to incentivize that. We incentivize that through credit lines, loans for the producers. And basically, since those technologies are really more profitable, they can pay for their loans more rapidly, and they become more competitive, and then you create a circle, a virtuous circle of incentives, sustainable incentives in those programs. Another example that we are just implementing right now and builds on the basis of the ABC plan that I have mentioned before is a national program for the conversion and recovery of degraded pasture land in Brazil. I would just take these headphones for a while because it's getting really hot inside. Sorry. But in Brazil, we have around 80 million hectares of somewhat degraded pasture land. And we are targeting 40 million of them as a priority. 26 million of them are highly suitable for crop production. So we are incentivizing the producers in those areas to convert to crop production or start working with crop livestock integrated systems. For other areas, we are improving pasture management, and there is another segment dedicated to native vegetation restoration. So by combining that with other environmental compliance, for example, zero deforestation inside the rural property and other incentives, we are driving this change in Brazil, and hopefully we'll have even higher results by the end of the decade. Thank you.
That's fantastic. It really is. And this question of rangelands and the importance in that 2026 will be the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralism. So what a perfect time to be pivoting our attention to this appreciated grassland space. You talked about making a living at this, right? The profitability question. And you also mentioned subsidies. I think one thing we always have to remember is subsidies are very uniquely a purview of actually a relatively few number of countries. Most countries cannot afford to subsidize their farmers. So farmers do not have an even playing field around the world about what they're receiving for cash transfers, and that includes Canada and Brazil, but that also includes Zimbabwe, and some of the other countries that we've been talking about are not making that subsidy commitment. So it is possible to farm in a variety of ways with or without government intervention. But one of the things that we've found, and I think, Keith, I'll come back to you to ask you this question, but we found that making the right decisions with our soils years ago really has been a great decision for the profitability of the farm. And we always talk about farmers having a challenge to do this, but I think we need to stop scaring the conversation. If we can bring it back to soils and we say, looking after your soils, farmers are pretty excited about that, and you can make a good living with it. Do you think that there is also a potential, Sheila, for Indigenous communities as stewards of land and having proper sovereignty over their land to be able to make a living in this ecosystem if they have access to that sovereignty and good care of their soils?
So we've been able to make livings for ourselves since time immemorial when provided with appropriate sovereignty. One thing that I do want to clarify, I know this wasn't directly asked in the question, but since it's talk of the town right now, is the vast majority of Indigenous communities and the official stance of the Indigenous Peoples constituency here at COP is against carbon markets. So we do see that as a false solution and a potential for actually a reduction of sovereignty. I'd be happy to talk with more people about this and send off the official position papers if anyone is interested, but did just want to clarify that out there. So yes, we're not as concerned about it from an economic standpoint, but we would be able to, practice our rights to self-determination and be able to produce enough if we are able to go back to traditional practices. One of the things that I don't think people think about enough is how our industrial agricultural system and the pesticides specifically end up contributing to climate change. So for instance, for each kilogram of pesticide produced, that produces 30 to 40 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of pesticide. That's nuts. And in the US alone, in 2022, we used approximately 455 million kilograms of pesticides. That's a lot of CO2. So going back to traditional practices and using different crop rotation, relying on our natural landscape. For instance, sage actually has some properties that will reduce what we consider now in the Western conceptualization of it, pests against crops. And then also not being as concerned with maximizing production. A lot of why we are in this industrial agricultural system right now and maximizing production is based off of capitalist systems, and in particular a lot of industrial agriculture in terms of livestock and needing to produce extra crops for that. So I'm sure I'm not saying anything that people haven't heard before, but in essence, it's not just about also, having control over our land. It's like we're not going to be able to do the same system just with control over our lands. A lot of it is going to be required doing a complete mindset shift and a complete change and focusing less on how much we are producing or how profitable it is or whether or not we're able to make a living in our current kind of Western capitalist conception of it as it is. But a better idea of a good living for us is reestablishing our relationship with the land, and this is something that is absolutely possible if we are given adequate sovereignty.
So Keith, you are farming in this process as well. The description of industrial agriculture doesn't really capture the vast majority of farming, which is family farming, right? You're on a family farm. How has working with your soils given you a chance to make a living? Have you found that when you haven't gone on with a plow for 20 years that that's actually helped?
Yeah, I'm the 8th generation on my farm, and you're right, in North America at least, 98% of the farms are family owned and operated. For me, like every other farmer and rancher around the world, every day is a learning curve. You're always learning something new. You're always trying to try new things. You're peeking over the fence, looking at the neighbor, trying to steal ideas from them to better improve your operation, whether that's improving soil or whether that's improving your bottom line by doing techniques different that accomplishes both improving the soil and the environment. The environment. Farmers don't do things in isolation. And one of the things we struggle with government policies in particular is they're trying to accomplish checking off a certain box for a certain thing. When I do something in my operation to improve the environment, there's multiple co-benefits right across, whether that's improving the soil, whether that's improving our water absorption or our drought protection or lessening our emissions. Everything you do has multiple co-benefits, cleaning the water, cleaning the air for all of society. So there's multiple co-benefits that need to be taken into consideration. So we're always trying to learn to be better all the time. We don't always get it right. A lot of it's trial and error. But I go back to my earlier comments, by the more research and data we have, that will lessen the risk of the decisions that we make going forward. And the more I can steal from everybody to learn how to be better. You know, industrial farming, when I hear that term, I get a little bit confused because I don't know exactly what that means. In most people's minds that aren't in the business of farming, that's a bad word. It's a nasty word. And agriculture has been demonized for a long, long time for a lot of wrong reasons, especially in the climate change conversations. When the reality is we have great opportunity to really advance the climate change initiatives if given the opportunity. So you know, I would challenge anybody that says that farmers, or the majority of farmers, aren't trying to improve every day. And that improvement on each individual farm is going to look different depending on the type of operation, the type of soil, where you're located. Whether your governments are helping or not also has a big impact on whether you're able to do those improvements depending where you live in the world. So a lot of balls are turning and spinning in the air, but farmers are continuing to want to be better every day. It's just what resources do we have at our access to allow us to, or help us to do that.
And Keith, let's bring it back to something farm level and practical that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, which was the 4 R's. And you said them very quickly, but let's just pause and understand what you mean by that particular example.
Yeah, so I mean, Sheila was talking about getting away from commercial fertilizers and getting back to more natural sources. The 4R program is about responsible commercial fertilizer application. So you pick the right source of the nutrient that you want to apply, depending on the crop and depending on the time of year you're putting it on, but that's part of the 4R as well. But you choose the right source that's going to be the best for you, for your farm, for the soil you're putting in, the crop you're growing. You then choose the right rate, and for the most part that's doing a soil test to make sure you know what nutrient levels in the soil. Then we understand through research what the individual crop you're growing requires to take out of the soil. So you make sure you add that much nutrient in the ground so you're not taking away resources out of the soil. You make sure that you do it at the right time. You don't put fertilizer on in the fall for use in the spring if you live in a northern climate where you have a lot of rain or a lot of snow, a lot of moisture, and that fertilizer could wash away into our streams and et cetera, into our water sources. So you make sure you do it at the right time of the year when the crop can use it, take advantage of it the most, and then most importantly, the right place. And that is the right place in the ground where it needs to go, beside the seed, under the seed, with the seed, etc. And so you combine those 4 R's together, and you're going to optimize your fertilizer usage without maximizing the damage. Like you try and minimize the damage that you may potentially cause, because every time you use something, there's potential for it to go wrong. But using a 4R practice, which really farmers have done forever, we just have more of a formalized process now to do it. And so by doing that, we minimize risks that are out there. At the end of the day, a big part of what farming does is social, and by that I mean food security. We want to produce food to feed the world. Not all practices allow you to produce adequately to feed the world. So we do need things like commercial fertilizers to make sure we can maintain levels of production so people don't go hungry. And we're doing that now. So I think, you know, some things like 4R are very important for us going forward for soil health.
Fantastic. And I think Sig talked about this earlier as well, right? This sort of using a range of solutions. She touched on what is probably perhaps more aptly called traditional farming, not necessarily indigenous in the formalized sense of the indigenous community, but traditional farming systems in Africa that have used a mix of crops and a mix of root systems and respected how that intersects with the land. Anything in particular that you'd like to raise about some of those traditional crop mixes or indigenous crop mixes and interactions with, for instance, animals and forests that you think we can take away as a concrete action on our soils?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Two things come to mind. So one is I think that we need to have policies that allow Indigenous communities to better practice traditional burning techniques, because that's also very important both for proper soil carbon sequestration, but then also allowing plants that need fire to release their seeds to actually be released at appropriate times. And that's something that we see especially in the Pacific Northwest. I was talking earlier about how fires are creeping higher and higher up into the Pacific Northwest, into Oregon, in kind of unbelievable manners. So that's just one idea that came to mind. Another one is kind of combining both traditional crop mixes with the potential of using hyperaccumulators for soil remediation, because I think that's something that's very possible and can be used. There's a lot of research being done into that. In particular, one of the interesting things is a lot of species in the Brassicaceae family are very good at accumulating heavy metals. And unfortunately, considering 34% of Superfund sites in the US alone are located on Indigenous land, we kind of need that. We're at a pretty high need for soil remediation techniques which can be done with traditional plants that are going to vary, from location to location. But that's just a couple of things off the top of my head.
Those are great examples. I do some work in the hemp sector, and because it's such a deep rooted crop in the vein of SIG, and it takes up heavy metals, and they're starting to use it on a lot of remediation sites. So I know that's actually, really a burgeoning area, is to look at how we can use plants to remediate the soils, because that is exactly the process that we're talking about, is how do we get living things on our living soils working together so well. Bruno, as we start heading towards COP30, we're really excited. How would you suggest that we gear up this conversation about soils to arrive on your doorstep? What can we do as a soils community to be really concrete about this?
Thanks, Robin. Well, I would actually, something that has not really been mentioned in this session, start talking about resilience and adaptation. I mean, when you're talking about soil health, you're really tackling not only the intersection between the three conventions, but also paving the way towards future food security. And for that, we need to build resilience to the effects of climate change. So bringing that in a more pragmatic way to the agenda and to the discussions towards COP30, I believe that would be something very useful for us. And of course, I can't forget, and I should not leave this stage without reinforcing the need for more international cooperation, more mutual cooperation, and reinforcing multilateralism. Actually, we are only going to fill those gaps of implementation of mitigation and adaptation measures if we work together, following the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That's what we have agreed in Brazil in 1992 during the Rio Conventions. And if we are really getting this serious, coming to the full implementation of the Paris Agreement, and hopefully in November next year, we are going to be at that step. We should always remember that there's no safe path outside multilateralism.
Thank you. I think we heard it in the offices of WWF that we need to work together more, and nowhere do we need to work together more than in the United Nations and multilateralism. Do we have any questions from the audience for this panel? And I'm going over to this young lady, but I see Paul Liu, who is with Quatre per Mille, who's one of the world's leading soil experts.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Minnis. I am a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. I actually also grew up in the Central Valley in Fresno. And so my question really pertains to how do we start these conversations with farmers who are a lot more resistant to soil health talks? And because I have personally experienced some farmers that are resistant to it, whether it be because they're worried about policy or just not trustworthy of the science. So do any of you guys have advice regarding that? Thank you.
And well, Paul, since I'm going to walk right past you, do you have an answer to that question as I head over?
Thank you. You know, Robin, I have answered to all questions. Thank you. Yes, I would like to build on the fact that the 4 per Million initiative was born. Next year will be 10 years, so we will celebrate our 10th anniversary in Brazil, in your country, and I hope that Brazil will join the initiative. It's since in between. This is very important that was said before. First of all, our system of industrial or conventional agriculture isolated each farmers in its land. This isolation is something that is really, I would say, the heart of the problem. Because as you said, and as you ask your question, if you want the people to understand what's going on globally and mainly in the soil, they need to feed on each other experience. And the peer-to-peer farmers is the best way we can do. And this is a way to make the people more reluctant to adopt regenerative agriculture or agroecology or whatever you call it directly, to see what the results are in the farm where they are already adopting those practices for ages. And they will see the capital of the soil being maintained, which is very important for a farmer. The industrial agriculture is just tapping the capital of the farmers and not paying for that. That is why we get the food so cheap, and that we need to incentivize on the other side. So we need to keep that in mind, giving back the capital to the soil for the farmers, for the humanity, for the mankind on this planet. This is very important. And the other part I would like to complete, you're very right, Bruno, multilateralism needs to be back. Countries are more and more going to be individual and say, okay, we are more and more talking about food sovereignty, which is sorry, I don't want to say the word, but this concept is very interesting for the population, for communication, but it's not a reality. We are living in the same world, and we are all dependent because we cannot produce chocolate, coffee, wheat, and all the crops in only one country. So be a little bit smart, come back to multilateralism, and really address this question of soil health that we are doing with CASH, with other partners like Coalition on Agroecology. Please do that with us, but all the country have the responsibility and the policymaker as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And Paul actually has worked on the EU Land Directive and Soils Directive, which has been very progressive, but has been a strong voice for engaging farmers in that discussion as well. Sheila, I think that question might have been home to the California lady. What's your answer?
So my deepest apologies because I did not hear your question. I had an ear, they malfunctioned at just the wrong time. So if she could
Absolutely. Well, I'll do it inadequately, perhaps, but she grew up in Fresno, California, and has seen a number of farmers sort of resist the soil conversation as a portal of entry. And she was kind of wondering, how do you get people more interested in that soil conversation? How do you go to the farmers who aren't converts on this? What are your thoughts?
So, couple of things on that. I think one, there's a difference between engaging in farmers who are. Hold on a second. So none of this exists outside the system. I think the first issue is that farmers are so heavily reliant on the production of their crops for their entire livelihoods, and there's no safety net. They're not going to be willing to take risks on things that they don't know until they have a sufficient safety net. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is the health impacts of a lot of traditional, well, not traditional, a lot of conventional, rather, agricultural techniques to help the soil are something that they can think about and relate to, especially if we do develop the distinction between farmers who are owners of the farm and the people who are actually picking the crops. There's several important studies on the use of how pesticides and including endocrine disruptors like organophosphates have wreaked havoc on farm workers and people who are eating the food. I think it's a twofold thing. It's one, you can make sure that when they are going to a different technique, they're not going to go bankrupt and lose their entire livelihood to switch onto that. And then secondly, there are a lot of very common sense and very common humanity type of arguments for changing the way that we engage with our soils. And again, one of the main ways that I think about engaging with soils in a more healthy manner is the reduction of pesticides, especially because that's a farm worker justice issue. It's a climate change issue. I told you 30 to 40 times the amount of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of pesticide used. And it allows us to kind of shift back into a system where we actually have respect for the land and don't think of it as something to just like endlessly produce and take from and take from and take from, and actually think back about taking care of the land as a relative rather than as something that we can get a better ROI on.
Well, counting that soil as a precious resource makes a lot of sense. Keith, the same question to you. As a farmer, you've seen farmers that are more forward-thinking, farmers that are come along a little later, farmers that are all over the place, right? It's not a homogeneous community. How do you think we can bring farmers along in this conversation? And I'll throw in, because you talked about, sort of the what we can do to not just take from the soil. What about the role of soil amendments, of microbials, of organics and biochar and organic manure? I think you have a little bit of that on your farm. How do we help the soil along?
So I want to address the specific question, which I think has been addressed a little bit, about how do we get there, and it's all about the approach. It's all about the approach, because farmers are, regardless of the subject matter you're talking about in agriculture, they're afraid of thou shalt do this, right? And if you go to a farmer with the right approach, they might look at you with I'll use a Star Trek term, a Spockian eye at first, but they'll listen. And if you approach it right and present the right information, I can't guarantee they're going to jump in with both feet right away, but they're sure going to think about it. And that's better than saying, get off my land, go away. I don't want to talk to you. So it's about the approach to any type of new idea or a different version of an old idea. Farmers, as I said earlier, are always evolving, but we're learning more about old practices and how we can benefit them in new ways with new technologies. I grow a lot of legumes, forage legumes in a rotation, and I leave them in there for long periods of time because, again, I want those roots driving down. not only to make the soil looser and better, but I also know there's calcium down below that I can pull up through those roots to make accessible to the plants I'm growing now. And that's just from simple old me understanding that from doing it. But all kinds of things like biochar, for example, or cover crops have been made a tremendous recovery because people understand having a living crop year round is not only good for soil health, it's also soil protection as well. So depending on where you live and the type of soil you have will depend on the type of amendment that you may want to try. But I think the more information that farmers have in their hands to understand, especially if it's through plot research and where they can actually see, feel, and taste the results, the easier the buy-in is going to be. And that too is an approach issue. It's how we approach this with farmers so that here's something that's going to help you with your asset, your great natural capital asset, that's going to not only be better for your business, but it's going to be better for the soil overall.
Well, we're getting closer to the end, but let's come back to the policy side of this equation. We're seeing people approach farmers. Farmers are feeling perhaps a little defensive. I'm going to show Keith the same respect he suggested we should show other farmers. Keith is not a simple man. Keith is an incredibly intelligent man. And I think we do have a tendency to talk to farmers and say, well, you must be idiots, when in fact they're managing this incredibly complex biodiversity and ecosystem. How are we going to show them some respect from the policy side as well?
Well, I believe a lot has been said in that respect, because understanding the farmer's point of view, how Sheila has mentioned, and Keith, how can we approach them? Get some safe space to talk to each other and find common ground to work towards the sustainability path, and get confidence between the stakeholders. So this is the challenge, but there are some approaches that we can use, of course. Usually a farmer relies more in another farmer, in his peers, than in a policymaker or even a scientist and a technician. So building successful cases is key to plant the seeds and then scale that up through policies. For example, Keith has mentioned about no-tillage systems. In Brazil, actually, they are broadly used, especially for grain production. I believe that's also, given the distinct weathers that we have in temperate latitudes, it's becoming now more widely used, but in Brazil, it's been used for decades. And we have just build a project together with international partners and the Federal Association for No-Tillage Systems in Brazil to actually assess biodiversity and carbon storage in rural properties that has been using no-tillage systems in several regions for several years. And now we're getting the first results, and the top 15% of those properties, these are real farms, okay, commercial farms. The top 15%, they storage more carbon in the agricultural soil than in the native vegetation that they have preserved inside the same property. And we found that in 3 biomes, in the Cerrado area, Caatinga, and also in the southern part of Brazil. Of course, it is not exchangeable. I'm not saying that native vegetation and carbon in agricultural soils, but that's a fact. If well managed, there are some properties that they use no tillage for 40 years, 30 years, and that has built a lot of carbon on those soils, and also there is a dramatic increase in the biodiversity in those soils. So you start to find and put data, really scientific data, to show that those farmers that are not only profitable, they are also more sustainable, and they function as lighthouses for an inspiration for the other farmers. That's how we start our work as policymakers to scale that up.
Thank you so much, Bruno. We look forward to all being with you in Brazil. If we can thank this amazing panel for all their insights. Fantastic. And I'll let you slide down, and we're going to bring our final concluding speaker up. Dr. Muhammad Ibrahim is a leading light, a person who actually helped train Lee and has created a next generation of soil scientists, and a part of IECA, who's also going to be, in a sense, hosting us. Over to you for the concluding remarks.
Well, let me thank all the speakers for the information you provided during the debate. And I must say I learned from the information you provided, being a scientist that has a keen interest to work on the issues on soil health and in a system approach. We do agree that the discussion about soil health cuts across the COP on the UNFCCC, the COP, the biodiversity, but also on the UNCCD with degradation and desertification. And sometimes I wonder why these three conventions are working in isolation and not together, because many of the issues are here are cross-cutting, and therefore we need to rethink what are the strategies they're going to use and how do you elevate agriculture and soil health in these discussions. Also, the discussions about how do you work at different scales and looking at soil health, it's very clear that we should have a landscape approach, and of course, perhaps a regional, a nested scales approach from a regional to a landscape, or looking at a national level. If you are living in Central America and you go to the dry forest corridor, which is a very vulnerable area to climate change, then the issues in soils and soil fertility and food security and nutrition is very evident. It's very cutting across all the Central American countries in this dry forest corridor. So I think the approach on looking at multifunctional landscapes has been an approach that has been in discussion. There are different contexts in terms of sentinel landscape, which the CGIAR system has been using. And we think there you can look at the planning in terms of where the watersheds, where the biodiversity area for connectivity, and where from a system approach do we look at the spatial analysis in terms of the soil variability and how do you plan the farming systems within this context. But also I would like to draw the attention on the need for good governance of the landscape. How do you promote the integration of the different stakeholders, which I think you brought out very clearly about having the local governance and decision making. Based on my own knowledge, I think in terms of policy setting, I haven't seen the ministries of agriculture or the ministries of environment working together on how do you set the policies for looking at the landscape level. And I think that's something we need to work on to see how to get across this message more of the importance of the planning and getting landscape approach. Well, based on the data and of course what we've seen, the presentation of CIMMYT and also the WWF, there's good data in terms of the spatial analysis of how nutrients will vary on the farms and the need for looking at planning, looking at the diversity of crops. And here, how do we look at the agro-biodiversity? Currently, the food systems is based on a narrow number of crops being used, despite the fact that we have a large number of underutilized crops with a lot of nutritional value. But understanding the plant traits and the value in terms of what are the facilitating and regulating roles in terms of nutrient cycling or pollination or all of these services that you have from these different species, and how do you integrate this within the food system, that is very important. Already we have seen some countries advancing. For example, in Peru we have seen more utilization of underutilized crops of importance. The USAID have been working on the VAX program, which ICA has been cooperating, looking at what are the opportunity crops, and within the context of soil health and soil and looking at soils, in impacts on food security and nutrition, ecosystem services, and how do you reach the objectives of the mitigation and adaptation strategies. As mentioned, I think we need to elevate the discussion more in resilience and adaptation to climate change. We think that managing soils and having the impacts is very important to achieve these objectives. Well, we know there are gradients of different farming practices or climate smart practices, be it zero tillage or no-till We know that Brazil and appreciate from Argentina has been in the forefront in looking at conservation farming, and which has shown good results in terms of carbon capture, but also in ecosystem services. Agroforestry systems, which you have mentioned, there is convincing evidence that agroforestry systems is responding to the multiple goals that we have in terms of looking at productivity, but also diversification in terms of the food security, carbon capture above and below ground, water conservation, water security, and biodiversity conservation. If you will go in the whole of Central America, I would say 90% of the coffee plantations already agroforestry. The cocoa plantations are agroforestry. And the livestock farms, they have a network of live fencing throughout the whole landscape, which is promoting the connectivity and the conservation of biodiversity. And therefore, there are good experiences already that we can use. And for this reason, I think we need to promote more South-South cooperation. And how do we learn from the experiences already being developed? And how do you adapt these to the local conditions that you have? So I think there are good advances in these areas. But also the discussion about how do you pay the farmers for the price of the commodities? Based on our observation, we still think farmers are receiving less than 14% of what is all in the whole value chain that is going to the consumers. So I think rewarding the farmers who are investing more and taking the risk in terms of adopting of these climate smart practices, we need to build a case and also provide information on how can you do better pricing and providing them with better marketing information system so that they can be investing more in good soil management practices on their farms, and that's very important for us to generate more information. Well, the NDCs also, it's mentioned that there are less than 30 countries that are subscribed to NDCs, and now we're in the process of preparing resubmitting the NDCs goals and objectives. And I think we have a convincing case to show that soils are an important component for increasing carbon, but also responding to food security and nutrition. And therefore, we need to look at the policymakers who are making and planning how do we get out the information and providing them with the policy, preparing the policy briefs and information, providing them with data based on science and evidence. And I would like to say that there are good local knowledge also on the local scales. How do you systemize this information and provide them with this information for the planning in the scale? So I think that's very important. I think strengthening the extension services, we discussed the importance of having digital tools as one component. There's good advances in the use of digital tools. Also using practices at the local scale where already there are good practices being implemented, and how can you use that to scale up within a cascading model of having this at scale. Brazil has got example with the ABC model that has been implemented also. I was in the COP in Cali last week, and I saw many people looking at mapping the whole. There's one firm that is working on mapping the whole mycorrhiza in the whole globally. So you can look at the importance of what mycorrhizas will have in terms of producing that. So basically, I think the discussions are very good. We can use this information and see how to continue into COP30 to build on this, on elevating agriculture as part of the solution, emphasizing the need of soil fertility and soil health. And I take the advantage to say that ICA is championing one of the initiatives called Living Soils, which my friend Francisco Melo, he is sitting in the back. He's working with Professor Ratan Lal, and we've been advocating for the use of living soils as part of the solution for climate change, and with partnerships with the private sector, with the public sector. And here again, I think the consumers are playing an important role in driving the discussion for sustainable consumption. You mentioned about pesticides and nutrients and the need for transforming the whole agriculture practices. So here again, I would like to stress of the needs in terms of looking at the university, the curriculum development, the education, building the academic research and the private sector, and engaging the policymakers will be very important to having the policy and decision making at a scale. Thank you.